All right, well, welcome back to what is going to be the last episode for this series and actually for the whole year, unfortunately, but we'll be back again very early next year. So we've been working through this series. As you know, we're looking at Paul's imprisonment. Why was Paul in prison in Rome? And we're going to get to Rome eventually. It's taken us 7 episodes to finally get here, but we are going to get to Paul actually being in prison in Rome and really just how the story of his life ends in Rome, however that sort of turns out. So we are going to get to that. That's going to be what the final episode will be about. But there's a couple more details that we need to get to. Paul, where we left him, was still in Caesarea. And so he's not quite in Rome yet, but we have the circumstances now on which Paul is going to be moved over to there. So while we left the story, Paul had been in Caesarea now for 2 years, and it had just been stagnant. Paul had not been doing anything. He's just sort of been held there because the previous governor, Felix, just didn't know what to do with him. He was just happy to kick the can down the road and hopefully just see out the rest of his term and make this the next guy's problem. And so sure enough, that's what's taken place. The new guy, Festus, has come along and he has basically had to pick up this disaster of a situation, which is what to do with this guy, Paul. The Jewish people want him dead, but of course, Paul's got a lot of followers. He's supposed to be the head of this movement, or certainly one of the lieutenants of this movement, that if he's going to kill Paul, that's going to work out badly for him in the sense that Paul's followers are going to, they might potentially riot. I mean, who knows how that's going to turn out. So it's one of those situations where you just wish it would go away because whatever you do with this, it's not going to turn out well for you at the end. It's really just sort of what's the best of two bad situations is kind of the one you're hoping for. So that's what we found ourselves anyway. And what had happened was that they had reopened the trial under this new governor. And so the Jews had come and they'd re-prosecuted the case. And what had really happened was that it was exactly the same court case as had happened 2 years prior. Same arguments were being made, the same accusations, the same defense. Everything was the same as it had been before, to the extent that Luke just basically summarizes the whole thing in a couple of sentences and says, look, it's... They made their accusations, none of which can be defended. Paul said, I'm not guilty of any of these crimes. And really that was it. There was no other way to deal with this. And so what they sort of pushed the governor to is this, hopefully that he would agree to have Paul tried in Jerusalem. And now the governor knows that there's something suspicious happening here, that this won't end well. And Paul himself is very aware of what's going to happen if he ends up back in Jerusalem. He's going to die at some point along the way. This won't end well for him in any way. And so he realizes that the only option he's got left is to play his literally get out of jail free card, which is his appeal to Caesar. Now, of course, it may not be a get out of jail free card, but it's certainly a privilege that he has as a Roman citizen, which is to take his case to the equivalent of the Supreme Court. If the local court doesn't come up with a verdict that is satisfactory, you still have another higher appeal that you can make. And in the case of the Roman Empire, in that case, it was this appeal to Caesar. And so we saw last week how all of that sort of connects back to the old Roman Republic, how that's become sort of reimagined, renegotiated now under the emperor. And what we have ultimately is a direct appeal to Caesar himself, which in this case is the Emperor Nero. And that's what Paul has been left to do. Now, it seems like an easy solution just to say, well, I'm going to have my case tried in Rome, but it's not that easy, and that Paul's going to have to make it all happen. He's going to have to fund the entire thing. He's going to have to fund his own travel there, his accommodation, and we don't know how long it's going to take. He could get to Rome and spend years there. We don't know. It's only going to be whenever the emperor decides that he wants to try the case. And of course, if he wants to bring witnesses, he has to bring them along as well and accommodate them. So it's a massive procedure. And so although it's a great advantage that a Roman citizen has to make their appeal to Caesar, it's also a very practically expensive one that would really mean that very few people could actually access it. Nevertheless, Paul is obviously in a position where he can do this. And so he decides that the only outcome for him, the only option for him at the moment is just to take that risk. He knows that if he goes back to Jerusalem, that will be the end of him. It may still be the case that he ends up dead in Rome, but he's got more of a chance of survival there. And more than that, and this is something that Paul would certainly have in the back of his mind. To have an opportunity to preach to the emperor is an extraordinary privilege, an extraordinary opportunity to preach the gospel, because Christianity at this point is becoming more and more known. It's becoming, it's identifying itself apart from its Jewish origins, particularly because more and more Gentiles are becoming Christians. And in the next generation, really Christianity becomes almost an entirely Gentile movement. And what that means is that it's its own thing. It really has less and less connection with Judaism, which it could hide under before. It could meet in synagogues. It could say, we're just a branch of Judaism, and people would say, yep, that's fine, because clearly it was. But it's becoming more and more of an independent thing. In fact, in only a couple of years from now, we're going to see Nero persecuting Christians specifically as their own individual group. And so what Paul has now is an opportunity to present a case for Christianity before the emperor himself. What that will hopefully result in will be a more favorable outlook, because Christianity is becoming more known, but it's only going to be known by its extremities. As with all of these movements, it's only ever known by its extremes, the ones that make the most publicity. And so Christianity is on the one hand becoming known, but also could be getting a bit of a bad reputation, particularly in that it is vehemently opposed to worshiping the emperor. And that's going to be a problem that's going to plague the church for the next few centuries. But that's already going to become an issue, that we choose to worship Jesus and not Caesar. And in and of itself, that's a form of treason. So for Paul, this is a great opportunity, is the point. Paul is able to now present a case for the Christian message in front of the emperor. And if he can convince Nero that this movement is not a threat to his empire, that's a good thing. That's a good outcome for all Christians everywhere. And this is becoming more and more of Paul's concern. He's more concerned now about how the churches are behaving themselves because of the view that the rest of the world is going to take, or at least their cities, but certainly the rest of the empire. How they might perceive Christianity is going to be based on what they see in these local communities. And again, if they're seeing these extremes and these negatives and this seemingly treasonous type of behavior, that's not going to be very good for Christians elsewhere, because they're all going to be tarred with the same brush. So as difficult as it is practically for Paul to make this case before the emperor, it's also an incredible opportunity. And he's by far going to be one of the best spokesmen for the movement, being one of its chief representatives. For him to make a case for this movement is going to be extraordinarily beneficial, hopefully, for everybody else moving forward. And so certainly that's at the back of Paul's mind. And it's not that Paul's going to be doing some anomalous thing of, preaching the gospel when he really should be giving a defense. His defense actually is the gospel. He is under trial, or under arrest and on trial, specifically for his preaching of the faith. As he keeps reiterating, what this all has come back to is a theological dispute. Paul believes that Jesus is the resurrection, that he's the Messiah, that he's the one to come, that he is God made flesh. He believes all of these things, which is at the core of his message, and that's ultimately what the Jews are persecuting him for. So all of this trouble stems from his theological belief. And so for him to give a defense, he has to preach the gospel. He has to present Jesus for who he believes that he actually is. And so just in giving a defense, Nero is going to hear the gospel. So that's the inevitability of him giving a defense. So this will work out. Whatever the case is, there's going to be a great opportunity for him to preach this. And when we see later on in Philippians, and we might come back to that next year and look at Philippians more closely, but you see this coming through in the letter to the Philippians. The Philippians say to him, hey, Paul, we heard you're in prison. This is really bad. Are you okay? And his sort of response is, hey, look, it's not great. I'd rather not be here. But as a result of my imprisonment, all of the palace is hearing the message, including the emperor. And so he's already seeing this positivity, this positive outcome that will come from him going to Rome. So it is a good thing. There is a great upside to him going back to Rome. The downside still, of course, being the cost of getting there, as well as that, the time it's going to take. This may be the very last thing he ever gets to do. The very next time he gets to preach might be his last sermon, because it might be his defense against Nero. So, it is going to not just hinder, but basically cripple all of his missionary activities. This could be the very last time he ever sees freedom and the ability to go out and to keep planting churches. So he's resigned to the fact that this could be the end of his life. Now, and another thing to keep in mind is that Paul, by this stage, is getting towards 60 years old, which is pretty old. I mean, that's extraordinarily old for anybody in the ancient world. So to live to 60 is pretty much at the end of your life anyway. So if Paul's like, if I'm going to go out in the next couple of years, which I probably would have done anyway, hey, I'm going to go out with a bang, right? I'm going to go out in the best way possible, which is to preach this gospel to the emperor. And when you consider just the extraordinary miracle that has been this journey. If you think in the way that Luke tells the story, when we're telling the story of Luke's his explanation in Acts of this trial that Paul's going through, but the story that we're reading about here, Paul's trial, comes at the end of Luke and Acts. The Gospel of Luke followed in part 2 by the book of Acts, the Acts of the Apostles. They're two parts of the same story. And so the point of Luke's story as well is to say, here's this little baby Jesus born in a stable, or born, where the animals are sleeping in this little village of Bethlehem, and he's a nobody kid, and, he's just another baby born on a random night. The point that you start with this tiny, literally little baby, and we go from him growing up and becoming a preacher to a few dozen people and to a few thousand people, but still only restricted to the region of Galilee and Judea, and then the message begins to go out into the rest of the world, and then finishing with this being preached to the emperor within a 30 to 35 year span. There's that just as a theme of the Gospel of Luke and Acts is an extraordinary story that Luke wants to tell. This tiny, tiny little beginnings to this extraordinary climax at the end of the story. We're about to go and preach before the emperor. So that in and of itself is a great theme that's running through this story. It's really quite an extraordinary thing. So all that to say, Paul it's probably a bittersweet thing, where the situation that Paul's in, that this is the only choice that's left to him, that this is the only way he can preserve his life and hopefully get himself out of the circumstances. But at the same time, it's a great opportunity that he'll get to preach to the emperor. But there's one more wild card that we need to throw into the mix here, and that's Nero himself. Nero is the emperor at this time. Nero is he's the fifth of the Julio-Claudinian emperors that we call the first 5 emperors, beginning with Augustus, and so he's the fifth one to come along. And what we know about Nero is that his life becomes increasingly eccentric, increasingly what we might even say is insane. There'd been a previous emperor, two before him was the Emperor Caligula, who himself was just radically crazy, narcissistic, vicious, evil. I mean, all the stories portrayed about him is just there's an absolutely horrific monster of a man. But he only ruled for about 4 years because, they executed him because he was just such a terrible guy. But Nero, he hung around for quite a while. He's now been the emperor since 54, and he's going to rule up until the year 68. So he's in there for a long time. All right, he's been around this. He's been in power for quite a while at this point. Now, the real turning point in Nero's reign happened in 59. So it happened in the time while all of this was happening, while Paul was under arrest in Caesarea, and that is that he murdered his mother. There's Nero, not Paul. Nero murdered his mother, Agrippina. And the reason that he did this was that initially when he came into power, he was only a 17-year-old boy, and it was really his mother that manipulated the situation in order for him to come into power. She was married to the Emperor Claudius, and so through a series of maneuvers had made or compelled Claudius to adopt Nero as not just his son, but as his heir to the throne. And so Nero replaced the natural-born son Britannicus as the next heir to the throne, to become the next emperor. And so that's really good and well. She's got him positioned that once her husband dies, he's going to be the next one in line. But then, of course, we just have to wait for him to die. Now, as the story goes, Claudius died from eating poison mushrooms. Now, we all know who gave him the poison mushrooms. Now, there's various sort of accounts of the story, but basically what the common assumption is that she was the one who murdered him so that she could put her son on the throne. But as a 17-year-old boy, he's still a 17-year-old boy, right? He doesn't have the age and the maturity to do what he's about to do. He's still a mummy's boy, really. And so what she's really doing here is that she's positioning herself to be a co-ruler. She herself can't hold political office because she's a woman, but if her 17-year-old son is the emperor, she's ultimately the one pulling the strings. And so very early on in his rule, you actually see images both of her and him in power together. You see coins that are minted of the two of them together. There's a great statue that's actually in Aphrodisias over in Turkey on display in the museum there. And it's a picture of him being crowned as the emperor, still as a teenager, with her being the one to crown him. And the way that they're sort of positioned, the way that they're portrayed, is that they're co-sharers of this power. And so she's the one who's really ultimately the real power player in all of this. But as he's growing up and as he's becoming more powerful himself and starting to come into himself as a man and realizing that he doesn't want his mum telling him what to do anymore, he's starting to sort of separate himself from her influence, and eventually he murders. And there's different accounts of the way that he does this, but eventually what it really boils down to is that he stabs his mother to death. Now, I say all that to say there's going to be something that's going to shift in a person's thinking when they murder their mother. Now, I've never murdered my mother, and I certainly never intend to, and I hope that nobody ever that's listening to this ever would. But I could only imagine that if you kill your mother in cold blood, there's something going on in your head that's not very good, and the very action of doing that is going to make that a whole lot worse. You don't just do that and carry on with life as though everything is normal. So there's something already starting to happen in Nero's mind, and that would certainly be the trigger to that. And we know this from accounts of his life, that for the rest of his life, up until the end of his reign, really up to the end of his life, he's going increasingly crazy. His rule becomes increasingly erratic, and he's becoming more and more paranoid, and really he becomes a tyrant. He becomes a real monster of a man, and his rule really declines into something absolutely horrific. He really goes down in history as being one of the worst rulers that the world has ever seen. And this really sort of comes about. That was the real pivotal point around the time of his murder and his mother, when all of it seems to come unstuck. And again, that's around exactly the same time as Paul is going through making this decision to make an appeal to the emperor. So he is appealing to Caesar, but at the same time, he's appealing to a bit of a wild card. He doesn't quite know what he's going to get at the other end. So there's a lot of things that are going on in Paul's mind when he makes this decision to make his appeal. But nevertheless, this is the only card that he's got to play, and so naturally that's what he needs to do. But that leaves a problem, and this is where we finished off our story last week. The problem now that we have is, what are we going to tell Nero that this guy's here for? Now, you think about the sort of crimes that an emperor would deal with are ones that are just a threat to the whole empire. He's going to be dealing with the really serious stuff that is a direct challenge to his power and his place as the emperor. That's not what this is. This is literally a theological dispute amongst a couple of Jewish rabbis. That's literally what all of this boils down to. And so this governor, who's supposed to be Rome's man in the region of Caesarea and Judea and the surrounds, this is the guy who's there to do the emperor's work. He's supposed to be dealing with all of this. He's not. This sort of stuff should not even reach his desk. I mean, this shouldn't even come to the governor's desk, much less go to the emperor's desk, because this is an absolute ridiculous situation. And it's already been established in the time that Paul's been there that he's done nothing wrong. Clearly, the man has done nothing wrong, and that all of this comes down to is that the Jews just don't like Paul and they want to get rid of him. And everybody knows it. But that's not Rome's problem, and that's certainly not the emperor's problem. So now he's in a real situation, Festus, that he's got, okay, you've made the appeal to Caesar. By rights as a Roman citizen, I have to send you there. But at the same time, I don't know what to tell the emperor, because you've done nothing wrong, and certainly nothing that is going to want to waste the emperor's time, and if I do send this and the best we've got is a theological dispute, how's that going to look on me, right? What does that say about my governorship if I can't even deal with literally a theological dispute amongst a couple of Jewish rabbis? Well, so anyway, the story continues. Festus is sort of trying to figure out what to do with all this. He's back in Caesarea now. He's done his rounds to Jerusalem. He's come back to Caesarea, and Paul's made his appeal. And so he's sort of looking for different options, any way that he possibly can to get something of a resolution to this situation. So we pick up the story, Acts 25, verse 13. It says, "A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. Since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king." So this is a pretty standard sort of practice. We've got this King Agrippa and his wife Bernice, and they're sort of rulers of a subset of this broader region of Judea and Galilee. So they're kind of... They rule that particular area, but of course they're going to pay deference to the Roman authority generally within the region. And so they come to pay their respects to the new emperor, to establish rapport, as all of these dignitaries are going to do, as all these rulers are going to do. So that's all very standard sort of thing. But it's a great opportunity now for Festus to try to figure out what to do, because what he's now got there is a Jewish king, somebody who actually knows this stuff, who knows Torah, who knows this whole world. And of course, Festus has got no idea about any of it. He's literally just arrived in Caesarea. He doesn't know anything about this custom as far as we know. So of course he's going to want to consult anyone he can, certainly people that are on his side, people that understand his predicament and that want him to succeed in this. And so naturally he's going to want them to have some sort of say in this, to at least give him some sort of advice as to what to do with this case. And so as the story goes on in verse 18, this is Festus talking now to Agrippa. It says, when his accusers got up to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crimes I'd expected. Instead, they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus, who Paul claimed was alive. So here's Festus trying to explain to Agrippa, just to try to catch him up on what's going on. He himself has only been there for maybe a few weeks, and so he's only just come up to speed with what's going on. He's had the trial happen in front of him, and he's realized this is a nothing situation. So now he's filling in Festus on the background of Agrippa on the background of the story, just to say, all right, so this is as much as I can gather from this, but what it all boils down to is exactly what Paul wanted from the beginning, which is the truth, is that this is a theological dispute, that there's nothing more that's going on here apart from that. And so he's just getting him up to speed as to see, look, can you help? Is there anything you can do with this? And so it says, then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear this man myself. He replied, tomorrow you will hear him. Now, I think Luke pretty downplays that a little bit. Tomorrow you'll hear him. I probably think there was a sense of absolute just relief, like a weight falling off his shoulders. Thank God. I was hoping you would say that. Thank you. Yes, you absolutely can hear him. Please help me with this situation because I've got no idea what to do. So the story goes on, verse 23 says that the commander Festus, Paul, was brought in. Festus said, King Agrippa, and all those who are present with us, you see this man, the whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. I found that he'd done nothing deserving of death, but because he made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. But I've nothing definite to write to his majesty about him. Therefore, I've brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of this investigation, I may have something to write. So I find that it's interesting the way that Luke puts in certain pieces of the dialogue in telling this story, because there's an overarching point that Luke wants to state here, is that Paul is innocent. That's really, and we're going to come to, at the end of this episode, we'll look at what Luke's sort of motivations would be in that. But the fact that he's just retelling this point, even the governor, but two governors now have both agreed this man has done nothing wrong. He shouldn't even be here. And now we're in this even more predicament of he's going to go to the emperor and I don't know what to tell him because there's nothing that this guy's done wrong. Now, again, the reasons for this we'll talk a bit more about later on. But basically the point is to really reinforce to the readers, Paul, yes, went to Rome and yes, he was in prison in Rome, but he went there as an innocent man. It was a point of dispute that got way, way out of hand. And so that's why Paul got there. Nothing more than that. And so you, whoever is reading this text, needs to understand that that's what this whole story is been about. And so Paul sees his advantage in this as well. For him to talk to Romans about this theological dispute is of no consequence because they simply don't care about this. And they don't understand this. They don't have the tradition and the customs of the Jewish people to be able to understand any of this, to be able to have any sort of view on anything that Paul is talking about. So he can talk to these governors and say, yeah, this is a theological dispute, and they're not going to understand. They're not going to care about any of that. But in talking to King Agrippa, a man who actually has some authority in this situation and more importantly can sway Festus, what Festus is looking for in Agrippa now is the wisdom of what to do next. What do I tell him? How do I inform the emperor? And what he wants Agrippa to do is to find some sort of crime. All right, maybe according to your own laws, he's done something wrong that I'm just not seeing because I'm not familiar with Jewish law. Give me something I can work with so that I don't look like an idiot when this guy goes to Rome. What can you do? How can you help me? And so Paul is aware of that. He knows what Festus needs from Agrippa, and he also knows what the situation is, to be able to reinforce for somebody who does know Torah, somebody who does know Jewish law, that all I'm doing is in alignment with what we've been doing for thousands of years at this point, for generations by this point. This goes all the way back to Moses. So there's nothing I'm doing that is of any shock here. I'm just a continuation of what we've been talking about for generations before us. And so Paul launches into his testimony once again, and Luke incorporating that testimony as, again, a way of reminding his readers that this is all of this comes down to. It's just that they disagreed with Paul's view of the Messiah. But he finishes the story. It's Acts 26:19. He says, "So then, King Agrippa," and this is Paul had just been talking about his seeing Christ on the road to Damascus, and he was reminding Agrippa, "Hey man, I used to want to kill these Christians." And so it wasn't, it was Jesus himself coming and appearing before me. It wasn't like I thought my way into this. I had to be, blinded for 3 days, and so to see what was actually the truth of the situation. So even I didn't want this in the first place. I'm kind of here because God dragged me along kicking and screaming. But anyway, he finishes the story. "So then, King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the vision from heaven. First to those in Damascus, then to those in Jerusalem and in all Judea, and then to the Gentiles. I preached that they should repent and turn to God and demonstrate their repentance by their deeds. That is why some Jews seized me in the temple courts and tried to kill me. But God has helped me to this very day. So I stand here and testify to small and great alike." So again, Paul is very smart here. What is happening is that you've got Agrippa who's trying to figure out something on behalf of Festus to be able to send to Rome, and Paul's just reinforcing all this comes down to is a theological dispute. All this comes down to, and let me go a little bit deeper with you because you understand the law and you understand maybe a bit of my testimony. Let me explain to you the full stories, and you'll appreciate the story. You'll actually have a context for this story. And so you'll probably even see more than these Romans that this isn't just a theological dispute, that maybe you'll actually see that this is true. Maybe you'll actually recognize that what I'm saying to you actually is the truth, that this is what we've been waiting for the whole time. I mean, more than just me trying to get out of this situation that I'm in, maybe more than just me trying to, demonstrate my innocence in all of this, but maybe actually convince you as well. I mean, the great outcome with this would be that the King Agrippa becomes a follower of the way. That's a fantastic outcome. So let's get into it. Let's have this debate and actually, let me explain to you the full story. And so maybe we can get like the double win out of all of this. And so it's just fantastic how this part of the story finishes, because Paul's just sort of doubling down now on his appeal to Agrippa. So at verse 24, Acts 26:24. So at this point, Festus interrupted Paul's defense. So basically, Festus is sitting there listening to all of this, just going, "This is insane. I thought this was just, he believed in a dead guy came back to life, and, the other Jews didn't do that. And, I don't know much more about the detail. Now hearing the whole story about a dead man not just coming back to life, but appearing to Paul and Paul being converted and all of this stuff. I mean, this is starting to sound pretty crazy, even to the ears of a Roman. And so he interjects and he says to Paul, "You're out of your mind, Paul." He says, your great learning is driving you insane. Now, you have to imagine the scene that's happening right now is that you've got, on the one hand, Paul probably, making eye contact with Agrippa and saying, "Hey, man, this is the story," and you probably having some sort of understanding there. But then sort of over here somewhere, Festus yelling, "You're crazy. This is all insane." I mean, even for a Roman, this is all sounding very crazy. And so Paul probably doesn't even turn his head to look at the guy. He just keeps his focus on Agrippa, and he just sort of dismisses Festus. He says, I'm not insane, most excellent Festus." But while still looking at Agrippa, he says, what I'm saying is true and reasonable. The king is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely to him. I am convinced that none of this has escaped his notice, because it was not done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do. So what we're going for here is almost a double win. If Paul can get Agrippa to accept his message and recognize that Jesus is in fact the Messiah, not only is Agrippa going to give a good account of Paul to Festus and say, "Hey man, this guy's innocent," but he might actually go, "No, this is a good man. Actually, this is really a person who is in line with the prophets." Basically, if he can get Agrippa, I guess, converted, for want of a better term, he's going to give a very good case for Paul and actually work really even harder to try to get Paul out of this circumstance. So Paul, he's playing this thing off beautifully, has been doing this for the last couple of years, and continues to play this circumstance off just absolutely fantastically. And so anyway, they hit another stalemate. They realize it's just reinforced Paul's innocence, and so they sort of convene the session. And it says in verse 30, the king rose, and with him the governor and Bernice, and those sitting with them. After they left the room, they began saying to one another, this man has done nothing, hasn't done anything that deserves death or imprisonment. Agrippa said to Festus, this man could have been set free if he'd not appealed to Caesar. Now, I have to laugh at that point, because I imagine Festus's response, Luke doesn't record it, but would have been something like, well, thank you very much, Captain Obvious. I understand that he's done nothing wrong. I could have told you that he's done nothing wrong and that this appeal to Caesar is just a waste of time. And all you've done is reinforce what I already knew to be true. So thank you for nothing. You can be on your way. This was all just a great big waste of time. I'm sure if he didn't say that, I'm sure he was feeling the frustration that might have come along with those kind of words. Nevertheless, again, we have this reinforced situation that Paul has done nothing wrong. Whatever Paul is about to go to Rome for is completely a non-event. It's just there's nothing going on here. So all of that has come to nothing again, and they all realize that, all right, look, we've got to honor Paul's appeal to Caesar. We need to send him along as per the traditions and the customs of Rome, but we got nothing to say. But the best we can do is just send him along anyway with everything that we have. And so what we're going to have, what's going to be sent along with Paul will be the letter that initially came with Lycia. So all those years ago, that letter that was sent very early on, and then all of the proceedings from the previous case when Paul was standing in front of Felix, all of those documents would have been gathered up, and then the same ones from this case that's just happened before Festus. So all of those are formal documents. In fact, they would have been filed away, and it's very likely, in fact, that when Luke was doing his own research, he would have gone to Rome and gathered these documents. He would have made copies to incorporate into his own story. So these would have all been gathered up, very formal documents, and they would have all been part of what was sent back to Rome along with Paul. And so away we go. We head off to Rome. But the key point in all of this is that it's become very, very clear. It's well established at this point that Paul is an innocent man. He's done nothing wrong. This has all been just a ridiculous situation. So Paul is now off to Rome with some of his witnesses, presumably Luke and maybe some others. And as the story continues, Paul ends up in Rome, and it would have been known already in Rome that Paul was on his way, but in anticipation or what is sort of overshadowing Paul's coming is again that he's innocent. This is the key thing again. I keep repeating this point, but what Luke is trying to stress throughout this entire story is that Paul has done nothing wrong, that he is an innocent man that has just been falsely charged, or it's a theological dispute that is blown out of all proportion. That's why he's coming to Rome. And that's going to play a significant role in what's about to happen next, because if Paul's going to be under arrest, if he's waiting for a trial before the emperor, what is going to determine the state of his arrest or his imprisonment will be determined by the level of the crime, the level of the threat that he presents to the empire, to the level of threat that he is as a criminal. And again, it's a theological dispute. This is not a threat. This is not a man who is a violent man. He's not an insurrectionist. He's not anything that is in any way a threat to anybody, and certainly not to Rome. And so he just wants to have his day in court. All right. He needs to have this in order to be set free. So he's not a flight risk. He's not going to try and escape. That's not going to be to any benefit to him. It's very clear that Paul just needs to make his appeal to the emperor, to have his name cleared and carry on with his life. So all of that plays in Paul's favor, because what it means is that what happens over the next whatever period of time is going to be much easier than it could have been if he was a potentially dangerous criminal. So the story finishes up now. We're in Acts 28, verse 15. It says, and so he came to Rome. The brothers and sisters there had heard that we were coming, and they travelled as far as the Forum of Appius and the Three Taverns to meet us. At the sight of these people, Paul thanked God and was encouraged. When we got to Rome, Paul was allowed to live by himself with a soldier to guard him. 3 days later, he called together the local Jewish leaders. All right, so there are a couple of important details that are happening here when Paul arrives in Rome. Firstly, so this story is taking place in around about 60 AD, thereabouts. So he's had the 2 years in Caesarea. He's about to spend another 2 years in Rome. But what's really important about the situation is that Paul is under house arrest. All right, so the thing about Paul's arrest or Paul's imprisonment in Rome, if you remember going back to the beginning of this series, we've got to remember that imprisonment is not the punishment itself. Imprisonment is where you're held until you have your trial. And so you could be there for a long time because it could take a while for your trial to be heard, but the fact of your imprisonment is only that you're being held there for such a time as that case is going to be heard. Now, of course, along with your imprisonment, as is the case in the ancient world, you need to support yourself. You need to be able to provide for your own provisions. You need to be able to provide your own food, or certainly have somebody that can provide that for you. Basically, you need to fund your own stay in prison so that you can have your day in court. So that's a very important determining factor for what's happening with Paul. We've already established that Paul is innocent. The whole point of this story so far is that Paul is an innocent man. He's not a threat to Rome or to anybody else, and so he can have a light imprisonment. In fact, what the story tells us is that Paul's under house arrest. He stays in his own rented place with a simple soldier to guard him. Now, the soldier's of course going to be there so that Paul just doesn't wander off, but he doesn't need a heavy guard. He doesn't need people with him all the time. What these soldiers would have been were part of the Praetorian Guard, part of the Emperor or Nero's personal bodyguard of several hundred soldiers. So one of them they'd probably go on a rotation. They'd be chained to Paul in his house arrest just to make sure he doesn't run away. But that's the only protection or the only guarding that he's going to need. And so that's all over there. But in terms of Paul's accommodation, where Paul's staying, again, he can stay wherever he wants. He can stay by himself. He can have his own place because he's not a threat. So he's not going to be locked away in some deep dungeon and chained away so that he doesn't hurt anybody. He can just stay in a place so that we know where he is when it's time to come and get him. We know that he's going to be down in that place. So that's to Paul's advantage, because what that means is that it gives him a level of freedom to be able to have people come and go. And we see that as the story continues. Paul is able to have visitors come and talk to him, and he can write letters, as we know, because he wrote the prison epistles from this time. So there's a lot of freedoms that Paul have, which is very beneficial, of course, to him. So it's the best possible way to be in a bad circumstance. If you're going to be under arrest, this is the best possible way to do it. But there is the issue that Paul has to provide these resources. Now, of course, he wouldn't be the one paying for it because he's under arrest. He can't go out and work to support himself. He's going to need other people to help him. Now, that's great, but it still is very limited in his ability to provide any sort of decent situation, any sort of decent accommodation for himself. And so if Paul is living in his own rented space, it's going to be the cheapest possible place that he can find. Now, what that would look like would be one of the top story dwellings in a Roman apartment block. Rome had approximately 1 million people living in the city. Now, Rome's not a big city, and 1 million people living in that is a very cramped space. And that doesn't sound like a lot. 1 million people in a city doesn't sound like a lot when we've got cities of tens of millions of people today. But in the ancient world, that was the biggest city that the world had ever known. In fact, we don't get a city that big again of 1 million people until we get to Victorian London. So it's an extraordinarily large city by the standards of its day. And all of those people crammed into this tiny little space. Where do you put them all? So what you need to do is build apartment blocks. You need to build 6-7 story high apartment buildings that you can basically force as many people as you can into it. And don't imagine these big luxurious suites. We're talking about shoeboxes. I mean, you've stayed in hotel rooms bigger than some of these spaces, and there'll be whole families staying in these tiny little boxes, very often without a window. Or if there is a window, there's no glass in it, and so it's exposed to the elements. And so you're living in an absolutely terrible circumstance, and often built by people who are building for the cheapest possible way, building with cheap materials, building out of timber, and building buildings that are costing them less to build, but they can charge the maximum amount of rent so they can make the most money. But they're not building them properly, and there's no building standards. It's just, good luck surviving in there. So you imagine a wooden structure which is built shabbily, could collapse with a strong wind, or you've got open fires because you've got to cook, you've got to keep the place warm. So you've got a wooden room that you've got an open fire in. It's a terrible circumstance. So forget about the fact that you've got a bucket for a toilet sitting over in the corner because there's no running water. If you want to get fresh water into the room, you've got to get into the aqueduct and bring the water back up. If you want to empty your toilet in the morning, you've got to, ideally take it down to the sewer, but generally you're just going to throw it out the window. What that means is that the higher up you go, the worse the situation's going to be for you. It's the most inconvenient situation, and particularly when inevitably these things burn down, because they burn down all the time. If there is a fire, there's no fire escapes, right? The only fire escape is either jump out the window or do your best to get down the stairs in the middle of the apartment block if they're not already on fire. So if you're up the top, you're going to die. Basically, that's the cheapest space because that's the one you're most likely going to die in. And so this is where we have to imagine Paul. Don't imagine him some luxury villa. No, he's in a dirty, dank little space chained to a Roman guard. He's got freedom again to have visitors come and visit him. He's got freedom to be able to write. Probably his letters have been scanned by the guard who's overseen and watching over his shoulder and listening to all the conversations that he's having with his visitors. So he's still with some freedom, but as well as that, still a certain level of restriction. But it's not the best circumstances that Paul finds himself in. And so this is where he's going to spend the next 2 years. From there, he's going to write out the prison epistles, Philippians, Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon. But again, imagine those circumstances as being pretty uncomfortable. They're certainly not luxurious. But for Paul, this is what he has to endure in order for him to have his day in court and to stand before Nero. Well, so anyway, it says 3 days later, he calls in the Jewish leaders. Smart move, because the Jews are the ones that the emperor is going to call on for to come and give an account of Paul. This is a Jewish dispute. It's the dispute between Jewish rabbis, and so naturally one of the witnesses that Nero is going to call will be Jewish rabbis. And so the first thing that Paul wants to do is build a rapport with the local Jewish leaders. Now, of course, they would have heard about Paul, no doubt, but hopefully they don't have the same animosity towards him as the ones back in Jerusalem. So if he can build a rapport with those guys when they are called up as witnesses, certainly they're going to hopefully have, or certainly they'll have a more favorable account of who he is and paint him in the best possible light. So that's a smart thing to be able to do. And of course, to meet with any of the local Christian leaders, build as much rapport as he possibly can. Because he's still got aspirations for Spain. All of this story all began with Paul wanting to go to Rome so that they can support him as he goes on his journeys up to Spain. That's still part of what he wants to do. So he's going to try to get as much support as he possibly can. And so part of that is going to come through the local Jewish community. But as the story finishes off, Acts 28:30 says, "For 2 whole years, Paul stayed there in his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. He proclaimed the kingdom of God and taught about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance." So what we're leaving this story on is something of a positive note. And this is Luke's intention. Now, I come back to the question of what is Luke's overall purpose throughout this story. But one of the other questions that we sort of think about is, why does Luke end the story here? Why does he cut the story off so suddenly? Because it seems to be quite an anticlimax. It's like you're right into the middle of the story, and then all of a sudden it just stops. In fact, I remember when I was first saved and I was reading through the Gospels, I thought, hey, if I'm a Christian now, I need to read through the New Testament, learn about Jesus. So I start reading through it all, and I get to Acts, and I'm just captivated by Acts. I mean, it's just such an extraordinary story. It's just so compelling. And I was just thinking to myself, how have they made a movie about this? This Paul guy is amazing. Really, really enjoying it. And I get to the end of this chapter and I'm like, oh, what happened next? He's in prison for 2 years. What happens next? And I remember turning my page over and it says Romans. And I thought, oh, this must be a continuation of the story. This must be Paul's time in Rome. And I start reading it, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ. And I'm like, this doesn't read anything like the narrative that I've just read. It took me actually asking my youth pastor, what's going on with Romans? He explained to me that it's a letter, and well, I came to understand what it all was. Now, I've learned a lot, obviously, since then, but that was my first experience of the gospel, only to say that I was so hooked by this story. Why does Luke end it here? Now, there's different theories, even down to when Luke and Acts was written, and there's all sorts of different accounts and different theories as to when it might have been. The general consensus is that Luke writes his account after Paul's life, so maybe up in the 70s or even into the 80s. And the reason why we assume that is because Luke bases his gospel on Mark's gospel. Mark is a great sort of source of information for Luke, and so Mark is written probably in the 60s, and so Luke has to have at least come after Mark chronologically. So whenever the actual date was, we're not 100% sure, but certainly it's after the life of Paul. That's the general consensus about when this was written. Now that raises the question then of what's Luke's motivation in writing this. Now he tells us what his motivation is. At the beginning of Luke and also again at the beginning of Acts, he addresses a certain Theophilus, who is the sponsor of this document. So this was an expensive task for Luke to have to do, not just to write it out on the cost of materials, but the time it would have taken to research and all of the gathering that Luke would have had to do to compile the story. That would have taken a lot of time, and somebody would have needed to support that. And so Theophilus seems to have been the guy who paid for this whole thing, and maybe for his own personal benefit. He probably wanted his own personal account. Maybe he's a rich guy who's become a Christian and now wants his own personal account of the life of Jesus and the story of the early church. That certainly seems to be at the core of what Luke's agenda is. But my suspicion would be, and the way that the church is portrayed and the way Jesus is portrayed, it's always portrayed in a way that not just some sort of in some hagiographical sort of way, and it's not some hagiography of, oh, let's just tell Christians from their best possible side that they're perfectly innocent, and anytime something bad happens, it was always everybody else's fault, but these guys are flawless. Not so much that, but really to sort of give an account of the Christian story in a time where Christianity is facing persecution. By the time Luke's writing in the 70s and 80s, Christianity is definitely on the Roman radar, and it's increasingly persecuted. They've already been through the Neronian persecution, and it's sort of as a flow on from that, Christianity is going to be marked out as something of a negative. Certainly the way that they refuse to worship the emperor is something that's going to work against them. And so it's coming at a time when Christianity needs to be at least shown to be what it is. If you're talking about a second and third generation movement, you're getting people coming into the faith who don't know the original story. They probably weren't even alive when Jesus was around. And so they're part of this movement, but they're also hearing about its origins. Well, Jesus was crucified. That doesn't sound very good, because Romans don't crucify people that are good people. Well, sometimes they do, but that's not a great way to start a story. And Paul, who wrote all of these letters that we draw on as inspirational scripture, he was arrested and he was ultimately martyred under Nero. Now, just as a little side note, by the way, what actually happened to Paul? Because we don't know after this point. Paul was in prison for the next 2 years. What actually happened to the guy? Well, we know that he was martyred under Nero. So that has to have placed his death before the year 67, because in the year 68, Nero committed suicide. So the two assumptions are Paul was either martyred in 64, which is during Nero's persecution of the Christians after the fire of Rome. He blamed the Christians. He started persecuting. Peter was executed at that point. Paul traditionally has been martyred, was martyred at that point, or 67. So just in the time before Nero's death. Now, what that would presume is that Paul, in fact, got out of this imprisonment, and the tradition says that he did get to Spain and all of that happened. That's another story. But by the time of Luke's writing this, there are different accounts of Christianity, or there are elements of its origin story which can be taken the wrong way. The fact that Jesus was crucified, the founder of it was crucified, and that Peter and Paul, both of them were martyred as well. They were killed as insurrectionists. That doesn't set you up very well. That can very easily be spun to be this is an insurrectionist movement. This is a terrible movement. And so what is, in my theory, my thought would be, my guess here is, and take it for what it's worth, is that what Luke is trying to do is to tell a new generation of Christians the origin story from up until the point where they know of. They know that Paul was martyred under Nero. They may not necessarily know why. As the message is spreading, as Christianity is spreading, that part of the story is not maybe necessarily being told. It's not as a fundamental part of what this Christianity is about. But there's rumors that Paul was martyred, and this is a bad thing. And so what Luke is trying to do is to give an account of what happened up until the point of that story. Now, it's interesting that you do this with movies, you do this with documentaries. In fact, I was just finished watching a documentary on Netflix about Donald Trump. Now, whatever you want to think about Trump, I don't necessarily care. It's just an interesting documentary. Everyone knows Trump as president, but most people don't know about his life. They might have heard bits and pieces, or they might have seen the name Trump through the 80s and 90s and even into the 2000s and 2010s. I mean, this guy's been around for a long time, but they don't know much about him. His story is, for those who are following him closely would know about him, but for the rest of the world, I grew up in the entire time that I was growing up, Donald Trump was this was somebody I didn't know. He was doing his thing and he was becoming a very famous person throughout my lifetime, but I was not aware of him. I didn't know anything. I just heard bits and pieces from The Apprentice or all of that. But it wasn't until he became president that all of a sudden now everybody knows him. Now he's in every newspaper. He's in all the stories. Everybody knows Trump as president as of 2016, but no one really knows much about him before that. Who is this guy? Where did he come from? How did he become president in the first place? And so the way this documentary told the story was it goes back to his early life and his early business religious career, and it works his way through in his marriages. And, it's a pretty damning story. It's not, it's not the best sort of story, but it's who he is. And so it's telling the story. And where it finishes off is he's about to make his run for the president. He's about to, the circumstances that led up to his making a final decision to run for president in 2016. And that famous scene where he comes down the elevator at Trump Towers and he makes his announcement that I'm going to run for president. And then the documentary ends because everybody knows the story after that. What we don't know is the story leading up to it. And so who is this person? What is the truth behind this person? Good or bad, whatever you want to think about him. You know the spin, you know the story of him as president, but you don't know who the man was before that. And so I liken that to what's happening here with Luke. What Luke is trying to do with this story is everything leading up to, Paul, his martyrdom, and you know what happened after that. You're part of what happened as a result of Paul's martyrdom. You've now come into the church after that, and you've heard the story that Paul was martyred, but you don't necessarily know what led up to that. And I think the fact that Luke has spent so much time telling this story, trying to really drill down into the details of Paul's trial, so much more detail than anything else he's told in the rest of the gospel. There's more detail about Paul's trial than there is certainly about Jesus' trial, which is arguably a more important trial. So much detail about Paul's. You would have to say that Luke really wants to stress the fact that he's innocent. And so the way that he's told that story is to make it very clear for the generations that are going to come after him that yes, Paul was martyred, but not for the reasons that they'll have you think. That he was an innocent man all the way. And in fact, if you really want to read the spiritual element to this, what this created was an opportunity for Paul to preach to the emperor, that Paul actually had the opportunity to preach the gospel to Nero. And if you want to look at it that way, God maybe even orchestrated this story in Paul's trial in order to have that outcome. So again, take that for whatever it's worth, take it all with a grain of salt. That's just my sort of theory, I guess, behind why Luke told the story the way that he did and why he cut the story off so abruptly at a point where everybody who's reading the story at that point would have known what happens next. But there we are. I think that's, for at least in my mind, that's why Luke does it the way that he does it. But the bigger point is, this is the whole story then of why Paul was in prison. And maybe for you that are listening, maybe for this generation, maybe it's something we need to still hear about again. Maybe this is just a reminder of, how did Paul get to prison? We know he went to Rome. We know that he wrote some prison epistles. But what was that all about? And so the way that Luke tells the story, given a bit of extra historical description that hopefully I've been able to bring, maybe just to unpack a little bit more about really what was this very significant point in the church's history and what became a really pivotal point in the church's history as well. But at any rate, hopefully it's just been helpful. Hopefully it's been a helpful explanation of the whole story. Thank you for following through it all. Hopefully it has been interesting if you have been following through since the beginning. But as I said, this is the last episode for not just for this series, but for the whole year. So hopefully we'll be back in January with some new topics, some new stories, and some new ideas about where this whole New Testament story is going. So I'm really looking forward to that. Have a fantastic Christmas and New Year, and I really look forward to seeing you in the new year. All the best.